Well, who doesn't love a big wagon? And what we have here is the last of the big wagons from the domestic automakers, this 1978 Ford Country Squire. Now, why do I say that this is the last of the big wagons? Well, after this point in 1979, Ford would redo the Country Squire, and it would be on the downsized platform. And by this point, General Motors, the last year for their big clamshell wagon was 1976. For Chrysler, the last year of the big wagons was 1977, including the pretty awesome Town and Country. And this was the last year for Ford to have its big super-sized wagon, 1978. Now, why is that? Well, in part, Ford was really averse to downsizing their vehicle lineup. So while General Motors downsized all their full-size cars for 77 and their intermediates for 78, it would take Ford until 1979 to downsize their lineup, in part because of capital constraints, but also because the Ford engineers and Henry Ford II were just loath to downsizing. They thought that Americans wanted big cars, and that's really what they wanted to buy. Of course, that wasn't a great place to be when the second oil crisis would hit in the late 1970s, and, well, GM was kind of out ahead of the game, and customers generally liked their smaller vehicles that had about the same interior room and trunk room as well as the vehicles that they replaced. Now, interestingly, while this Country Squire is a big wagon and it's heavy, it's about 5,000 pounds, the interesting philosophy that Ford had with respect to wagons during this era is that if you got the Mercury wagon, for example, both the Mercury and the Ford wagons rode atop a 121-inch wheelbase, which was the standard Ford wheelbase. Normally, Fords rode atop a 121-inch wheelbase. Mercury's a 124-inch wheelbase, 3 inches longer than the Fords. And then Lincoln's rode atop a 127-inch wheelbase during this time frame. But even if you got the Mercury wagon, you actually got the short wheelbase. So you got shortchanged a little bit. And amazingly, the wagon, from a Mercury standpoint, is actually shorter than a Mercury Marquis, as an example, coupe or sedan, because it's on the LTD wheelbase. Some of the other automakers, like GM, employed the opposite philosophy. No matter what clamshell wagon you got from 71 to 76, it rode atop the big 127-inch wheelbase. So if you got your GM clamshell, you got the long wagon. If you got your Ford, you got the short one. And Chrysler generally also had their vehicles on the longer wheelbase, I believe 124 inches during this time frame too. So Ford was really the outlier when it came to the overall wagon length philosophy. Now, this particular wagon is finished in an awesome color called Dark Jade Metallic, and this is a 4,600-mile example. What a sweet wagon and a sweet color, especially for 1978. It's loaded with quite a few options. You can see here the cornering lights, also has the Country Squire trim, the body side molding. This is an upper-end wagon, and on the Ford LTD Landaus as well, the coupes and the sedans, at this point, they had the hidden headlights. Ford was big into hidden headlights during this time frame, which was nice because it looked cool, but, well, they also could be prone to failure. The hidden headlamp actuators were vacuum-operated. If you got vacuum leaks in the system, then you were kind of in trouble, and the headlight doors were made to fail open. So one of the things to check for when you buy one of these cars is, do the headlight doors pop open very shortly after you turn the car off? They should at least stay closed, I would say, for a day. Otherwise, there's a vacuum leak somewhere in the system. Now, unfortunately, one of the things that Ford didn't do during this era was that they did not finish the area behind the headlamp door. It was just basically the headlights. And while I can understand why, it's nighttime, so who's really going to see what's behind the door? They're just going to see the oncoming lights. It doesn't quite pan out that way if your vacuum fails and your headlamp door is stuck open all the time. And of course, there's those hours in between kind of, let's say, the waning time of daylight and then absolute pitch darkness, where you want the headlights on, but it's not dark. And so a passerby can see into this headlight door, and unfortunately it's unfinished. I think one of the best cars to finish off the headlamps with cool trim actually was the 81 Imperial. Now, as we transition to the rear of the car, you'll notice that we have the luggage rack up top and the air deflector to blow the wind across the back window so that the rain doesn't get stuck there. But you also have Ford's dual action tailgate. Ford really introduced this tailgate in the 1960s, And one of the great things about it is that you could either open it as a tailgate or you could swing the door open with the handle that you see there. So this was a loved feature of the Ford wagons. And this particular one is not just a 2-row wagon, but it's a 3-row wagon. We'll take a look in a second at what that means on the inside. Now, before we go to the inside, I'll just say that this wagon, while I love it, has very typical Ford styling of the era. Notice how flat those front fenders are and how flat the belt line is. The car is basically just flat, and like you took a ruler and you drew the top of the fender along with the belt line with that ruler. No sweeps were used here in this case. And the bumper, I think Ford had kind of the chunkiest execution of these 5-mile-an-hour bumpers on the front and the rear. The rear bumper on these cars looks pretty enormous. You can page back to the last photo for that. So the styling to me isn't that great. I also wasn't a fan of the restyle that the LTDs underwent in 1975. I'm not a huge fan of that grille and the overall look up front, but hey, it's still a cool car. And don't get me wrong, I would love to own this beauty for sure. Now here's where it gets really fun, and that's the interior, because the interior is finished in a matching jade duraweave material. And I said duraweave, not cloth. And why did I say that? Well, first of all, we can see that the headrests are vinyl, as are the sides of the armrests. But this is actually not cloth. It's what was called kind of a poly-knit vinyl. It's actually woven vinyl that simulates cloth, but is ultra durable. And it's also easy to clean and stain resistant. So for wagons, it really was the perfect material. And to my knowledge, you could only get this material in the Ford wagons. You couldn't get it in the regular coupes and sedans. And Ford was trademark for this, and the Ford line was duraweave. Again, that was the name of it. Mercury had a different name. I think polyknit vinyl was the name that Mercury used to use, but it was effectively the same material. Now, this was designed to be a comfortable wagon, so you did get those dual front armrests in this particular interior trim package. And I would say, again, I have a Mercury Colony Park wagon with the duraweave polyknit vinyl seats, and the fabric's a little scratchy, but it's not offensive, and it sure does clean up well. And like I said, it is rugged and durable, so about what you would like in a wagon. Now, what about the rest of the interior in this Country Squire decor-equipped wagon? Well, take a look at the dash here. This dash was introduced in 1973. It carried through to 1978 on the LTDs. Also, the Mercury shared the same dash, and the Lincolns would also share it eventually, too, as a cost savings measure, getting rid of it. But you notice the droopy-eared two-spoke wheel that was common to all the Fords of this era. This car, again, is loaded. It has, you'll see in a second, automatic climate control, as well as power windows, power locks. You can't see it here, but power seat. You can see the intermittent wiper functionality. So, again, a loaded vehicle. And the faux wood grain trim, to me, I think looks actually pretty nice. Also notice that, unlike today, the headliner is matching color, as is all of the garnish trim, the A-pillar trim that you see there, etc. So you really got a green interior. Couldn't get much more green than this. And as we look at the dash a little bit more, you'll notice that automatic climate control there. It has the blue, white, red, and then there's temperature markings at different spacings. So this was automatic climate control. Somebody got, again, a very loaded wagon. And cruise control, you can see those controls on the wheel. Now, one of the interesting things about the gauges on this particular LTD, or Country Squire, I should say, as well as some other Fords of the era, was that by this point they had gotten rid of a separate oil pressure and temperature warning light and combined them into a single engine light. And I guess that was to save the cost of a bulb. Pretty funny. So you just have the engine light pop on when the temperature is too hot or the oil pressure is too low. And I suppose I can understand the rationale. It's like the average customer, there's a problem with the engine. Why should they care if the temperature is hot or the oil pressure is low? They should turn the car off. It really doesn't matter. And here you can see in the picture where it just says engine, and then there's a blank slot off to the right, because that originally, that series of 3 lights actually had a separate oil, temperature, as well as the fasten belt light was originally on the right-hand side, and then by this point it shifted to the left-hand side. Not quite sure why Ford moved that light, but they did. In the rear of this wagon, you have a trademark Ford rear seat here. Now, Depends on which wagon that you got in the 1970s. As an example, the GM clamshells, the third row seat actually faced front. And then in other wagons, like the GM intermediate wagons, they faced rearward. So it just depended. But Ford employed a totally different philosophy where you sat in this well, basically, and there could be two people that sat in these jump seats. You notice there's only one set of buckles and seat belts on each of the jump seats. So I think the intent here was that you weren't facing rearward, and that tended to make some people sick. And I guess Ford thought that it was better if you faced sideways. It helped with motion sickness. And it was one of the reasons why people bought Ford wagons, and it was probably one of the reasons why people did not buy Ford wagons. So just depended upon what you wanted as a consumer, but this was the philosophy that Ford employed at the time. Now here's where it gets interesting on this particular Country Squire, and probably the most unfortunate part of the entire car is under hood here, because this car just has Ford's 351 cubic inch V8. This is a 351M engine under hood. M for modified. For a while, Ford actually had three different 351s. They had the 351 Windsor, the 351 Cleveland, and the 351 modified. And no, the 351 modified and Cleveland are not identical. The 351 modified is actually a smaller 400, so the block is physically larger than the 351 Cleveland. So most people know Ford had two 351 cubic inch V8s, but they actually had three, although the M was derived from the Cleveland. In any case, you can imagine that with a 351 under hood that made about 140 horsepower in that zip code, that this 5,000-pound wagon wasn't going anywhere fast. And what makes it worse is that it came with a 250. This is an optional axle in this car. The owner ordered a 250-to-1 traction lock rear axle. 250, that is a numerically low or just tall rear end. So the engine's loafing along at freeway speeds, which I suppose is good for fuel economy. But in terms of taking off from a stoplight, ooh. Now, I owned a 75 LTD Brougham that had a 351 in it, and I will just say it was a dog. It was so slow until I richened the carburetor jets by about 4 thousandths. Then it became pretty bearable. But once you drive a big block car, it's really hard to go back to some of these small block cars, especially the 5,000-pound small block vehicles during this era, just because they don't have the torque, they don't have the horsepower. You could get the 400 cubic inch V8, which was a better choice. It had quite a bit of torque, almost 320 pound-feet. Then you could get the 460, the last year, the 460 in the wagons for Ford. That would have been optimal. But a 351 in a wagon with a 250-to-1 rear end, wouldn't have been my choice, but I guess somebody was trying to be a bit miserly. Now, one humorous thing that you'll see under hood here for the Ford lovers is, gasp, there are some GM components here. That air conditioning compressor, the GM A6 air conditioning compressor is right there up top. And then you have a GM Saginaw steering pump as well. So Ford was using some GM components. They went from the typical two-piston kind of York Tecumseh style compressor to this A6 style GM compressor beginning in 1972 on the Lincolns. Then it would eventually trickle its way down to this portion of the lineup, and I think it was needed. They kept trying to increase the capacity of the evaporator in the system with that York Tecumseh two-piston compressor, and they worked pretty well, but on these big wagons and on hot days, it's just a lot of air to cool off, and they didn't have the BTUs that this GM setup had. So, Ford borrowed a little bit from GM in the HVAC area as well as that power steering pump. Well, and there you have it, a detailed look at this dark jade metallic Country Squire. One of, I think, about 5,800 that were made in this exterior color according to the Marty report. So if you especially crave one in this color, well, you're just going to have to keep looking, I suppose. And again, this was one of the last of the Ford wagons, just a super cool ride. I will say these wagons, I own a 74 Colony Park. They ride extremely well. They just have a very poised, soft ride, even better, I would say, than the sedans. But you got a lot of glass area back there and a lot of heft overall, especially for that poor little 351 V8 with a 250-to-1 rear end to push around. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, take care.